This course contains recitations of the Quran in a secular context.
Maliki Yaumi ad-Din. For me, these are the most arresting words of Surah Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran. In traditional recitation, they conclude with a descending, plaintive scale, the sound of deep disappointment or foreboding, maybe even doom. The typical English translation renders them as something like Master of the Day of Judgment, although Maliki is sometimes given as King or Sovereign. But none of those really convey the full tenor of the phrase, something both rich and sparse simultaneously. True, Malik is simply master or king, and Yaum is unambiguously day. But Din is a different story, and changes the whole of the clause, constructing an imagistic apocalypse, pregnant with both promise and peril. In contemporary Arabic, Deen is typically translated as religion, and indeed in many translations of the Quran, it's likewise rendered as religion. But to say day of religion doesn't mean much of anything to a modern audience and suggests that the 7th century understanding of Deen was something else altogether. If you turn to classical definitions of Deen, you learn that it could mean system, power, supremacy, ascendancy, sovereignty or lordship, dominion, law, constitution, mastery, government, realm, decision, definite outcome, reward, and punishment. On the other hand, this word is also used in the sense of obedience, submission, and allegiance. So, while there are places in the Quran where any of these terms might be more contextually appropriate, it's apparent that the phrase as a whole means to convey something like that day when the absolute sovereign exercises absolute judgment in all matters. This moment and its precise workings becomes a central motivating theme throughout the whole of the revelation of the Quran, accounting for perhaps 10% of the entirety of the Quran. From the earliest revelations to the last, the Quran returns again and again to questions about the last day, paradise, and hell. What happens on the day of judgment? Is it a universal event or a personal, individual reckoning? When is the day of judgment? And once judged, what is the sentence? Is there reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked? These questions will occupy this lecture, revealing how the Quran uses Yawm ad-Din as a motivating concept and organizing principle. In the elaboration of the Day of Judgment, we enter the realm of Islamic eschatology, the consideration of last things. Or, in short, what happens when we die? To understand the Quranic vision of Judgment Day, paradise, and hell, it's important to first consider the beliefs and traditions that were prevalent prior to Muhammad's time. This is necessary not just to understand what people believed at the start of the 7th century, but also to know how the Quran challenged, affirmed, or otherwise modified these beliefs. On one hand, the Quranic eschatology was a radical departure from pre-Islamic tradition, while on the other, it can be understood as a unique synthesis of various ideas that were percolating but not yet mature. Taken together, the Quran provides a fully realized description of the afterworld, far more detailed and explicit than what is to be found, for example, in the Bible, either Jewish or Christian. To set the stage, the standard history of 7th century Arabian beliefs suggests that there simply wasn't a sense of life after death. From the scant evidence available, pre-Islamic literature is decidedly this worldly, emphasizing glory, honor, and pleasure, as well as defeat, dishonor, and pain, as experiences of physical life on earth that cease upon death. One could be said to live on only through heroic fame or patrimony. Where there is a suggestion of an afterlife, it seems to mirror the ancient Mesopotamian or Greek view of a shadowy existence in another world, home for both the righteous and the wicked, a pale reflection of life on earth. To the extent that disbelief in an afterlife was the prevailing position, we can well understand both why the Quran emphasizes the Day of Judgment, as well as Muhammad's difficulty in convincing his kinfolk of its reality. As we have seen, however, this was not the only opinion available to Muhammad's contemporaries. Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian ideas were also present in the region and provided an array of ideas about the afterlife. We don't have time to present a full view of these visions, but let me offer you a few salient points. First, the Zoroastrian tradition pioneered the idea of divine judgment, eternal paradise for the good, and torment for wrongdoers. Specifically, souls that are judged to belong to the house of lies are there punished in accordance with their sins. This relationship between sin and punishment, what is later called contrapasso in Dante's exquisite treatment in the Commedia, became later integrated into a wide variety of traditions. Second, Jewish and Christian ideas about an afterlife were still relatively contested. For Judaism, Sheol was the shadowy underworld where all souls existed after death, although by the 7th century it had become common to imagine that there were different chambers or territories where one resided according to one's righteousness or lack thereof. I should note that this vision of the afterlife bears resemblance to the ancient Greek and Mesopotamian ideas. For Christians, a more particular idea about resurrection had developed, although whether resurrection was of the soul alone or of soul and body together, there is yet no agreement. Writing in the 4th century, Augustine of Hippo imagined 4 different components of the afterlife, again corresponding to levels of sin and salvation. One common, if contested, source for visions of the afterlife, however, was the apocryphal Book of Enoch. This text, still accepted by Ethiopian Christians, provided a vivid description of both paradise and hell. The portions of this text that detail this afterworld are thought to have been written sometime during the 3rd century. What we can take away from this all too brief history is that the precise nature of the afterlife was an evolving concept, but one very much on the minds of many communities throughout the Near East. If we take this background as context for the Quranic vision, we might imagine that Muhammad's audience consisted of a variety of opinions. Some who outright rejected any notion of life after death, some who accepted a version of a shadowy netherworld, and others with a more elaborate notion of judgment, reward, and damnation, although the specifics of that system were still in a nascent stage. Given this, it ought be no surprise that the rhetorical emphasis of the Quran is on the reality of Judgment Day, particularly in the Meccan surahs. This became a sort of first principle in the Quranic message. To be among the believers means to believe in God's judgment after death. As the Quran repeatedly says, all those who believe in God in the last day and do good will have their rewards with their Lord. One particularly evocative description of Judgment Day comes from Surah 101. The crashing blow. What is the crashing blow? What will explain to you what the crashing blow is? On a day when people will be like scattered moths and the mountains like tufts of wool, the one whose good deeds are heavy on the scales will have a pleasing life, but the one whose good deeds are light will have the bottomless pit for his home. What will explain to you what that is? A blazing fire. This surah, ascribed to the Meccan period, provides a synopsis of Judgment Day and its consequences, one elaborated upon elsewhere in the Quran as well as in the traditional interpretation of the text. First, the day is characterized as something specific and particular, a moment of apocalypse. The Quran itself offers only vague clues as to whether Judgment Day comes upon the death of an individual or if it is a universal day. Many passages in the text suggest a shared and precise moment, but the Quran is not unequivocal on this. Regardless, on that day, the world is turned upside down in both literal and figurative ways. In Surah 101, humans become like moths and mountains like wool, the tangible and solid transformed into ephemera. The disordering of the physical world is accompanied by a literal measuring of one's deeds, as scales weighted by our acts. As Surah 99 describes it, on that day, people will come forward in separate groups to be shown their deeds. Whoever has done an atom's weight of good will see it, but whoever has done an atom's weight of evil will see that. This passage, revealed later in Medina, reiterates and reinforces the process of universal judgment, as well as the prevailing focus on our behavior. While faith is clearly a central concern for the Quran's vision, Judgment Day itself returns again and again to our actions. In this sense, at least, there is a balance between thought and deed in the Quranic conception of eschatology. To return to Surah 101, the phrase that those whose good deeds are heavy on the scales will have a pleasing life is a telling one. As scholar Narina Rustamji describes it, Muslims enjoy an afterlife within the parameters of a physically described afterworld. I'll have more to say and show about this world shortly, but the immediate takeaway is that life following judgment can be pleasing, or conversely, that one finds the bottomless pit for his home. The physicality of this is central, and the depiction of the two realms of the afterworld are explicitly imagined. And the title of Rustamji's book plainly lays out these worlds, the garden and the fire, heaven and hell in Islamic culture. You might read Dr. Rustamji's book to get a sense of the full scope of how the Muslim tradition elaborates this vision. But for now, it is clear from the text that paradise is viewed as a garden of physical ease and contentment, while hell is an infernal pit filled with physical pain and suffering. These conceptions might sound familiar indeed, especially for those who have read Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. This correlation might be more than circumstantial. In 1919, Miguel Asín Palacios, a Roman Catholic priest and scholar of Islam, proposed a theory that the story of Muhammad's Mi'raj, his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem upon the mystical creature Burak, and then visitation to heaven, was Dante's model for Paradiso. In other words, the physical materiality of Dante's vision that makes his Commedia so compelling as a drama may have been borrowed from the Quranic depiction of heaven and hell. So let's turn now to these two realms and their treatment in the Quran. Al-Akhirah is the Arabic term for the afterworld, which we might translate as the last place. In this place, there is both a heaven and a hell. Heaven or paradise is most typically referred to as Al-Jannah, or the garden, or some variation of that. But those who believe and do good deeds will be given the gardens of paradise. There they will remain, never wishing to leave. This garden is said again and again to be a place of lush repose. We shall admit them into gardens graced with flowing streams, and there they will remain forever. They will have pure spouses there, and we shall admit them into cool, refreshing shade. This description from Surah 4 is typical of the references to the garden, which nearly always feature water and regularly shaded places of rest. Elsewhere, it's said that the garden is replete with food and drink in abundance: honey, wine and milk, pomegranates, dates and grapes. The vision of paradise is unabashedly physical, a literal garden of delights. Surah 56 provides a detailed and cohesive view of the garden and is worth quoting at length. On couches of well-woven cloth they will sit facing each other. Everlasting youths will go around among them with glasses, flagons, and cups of a pure drink that causes no headache or intoxication. There will be any fruit they choose, the meat of any bird they like, and beautiful-eyed maidens like hidden pearls, a reward for what they used to do. They will hear no idle or sinful talk there, only clean and wholesome speech. They will dwell amid thornless lote trees and clustered acacia with spreading shade, constantly flowing water, abundant fruits, unfailing, unforbidden, with incomparable companions we have specially created. Virginal, loving, of matching age, for those on the right, many from the past and many from later generations. Perhaps surprising to a non-Muslim, the text is unapologetic in its depiction of sensuous reward, a reward of the body. This physicality extends also to sex. You might have heard of the infamous 40 or even 72 virgins promised to martyrs. I hate to disappoint you, but there's no such passage in the Quran. The beautiful-eyed maidens is a translation of hurin, the huris, that are indeed said to be companions in heaven. But as we've also seen, believers are joined by their spouses. That is, while never explicit, it is assumed that sexual pleasure would be a natural component of paradise. Those who enter paradise married will be joined by their spouses, while the unmarried, or God forbid, those separated at Judgment Day, would have companions for them, virginal, loving, of matching age. As Christian Lang describes it in his book Paradise and Hell in Islamic Tradition, in comparison with the culinary pleasures and the extravagant material riches enjoyed by the blessed, sexuality in the Quranic paradise is a rather subdued affair. The huris are of modest gaze, who comply with what the Quran enjoins upon pious men and women on earth, namely to lower the gaze and safeguard chastity. As for married couples who enter paradise together, the Quran delicately intimates congress by noting that they recline on couches in the shade. In other words, all those things that bring us pleasure in this world and this life are perfected in heaven and available for eternity. Spouses are said to be made pure for one another, and divinely appointed companions appointed for the rest, lest the rewards of heaven be given only to some and not others. This speaks, I think, to the frankness about sexuality that is likewise a feature of the Quran. Sexual union and enjoyment are assumed to be good and righteous parts of life in this world, and that goodness extends to heaven. But paradise isn't simply physical. Surah 9 says, God has promised the believers, both men and women, gardens graced with flowing streams where they will remain, good, peaceful homes and gardens of lasting bliss, and, greatest of all, God's good pleasure. That is the supreme triumph. Elsewhere it said that all that will remain in the end is God's face. These and other more intangible hints lead some interpreters to argue that the true joy of heaven is communion with the divine. Regardless, the physical rewards of the garden are central to the Quranic vision, while also serving as a counterpoint for the opposite, the torments of hell. Hell, in the Quran, is a visceral, physical punishment. The fire, called al-nar in Arabic, is given a specific name in the tradition, Jahannam or Gehenna, and is referenced in some 400 different verses throughout the text. Typically paired with a reference to the garden, the fire recurs again and again as the unambiguous place of punishment for those who reject God's message and commands. as recounted in Surah 88. Have you heard about the overwhelming event? Some faces on that day will be downcast, toiling and weary as they enter the blazing fire, and are forced to drink from a boiling spring with no food for them except bitter, dry thorns that neither nourish nor satisfy hunger. In many ways, the fire is the inverse of paradise, suffering and work instead of ease and repose, fire and boiling springs instead of shade and lush springs, bitter thorns instead of abundant fruits. Just after the description of the garden in Surah 56, we are given an account of its opposite. They will dwell amid scorching wind and scalding water and the shadow of black smoke, neither cool nor refreshing. Before, they overindulged in luxury and persisted in great sin, always saying, "What? When we are dead and have become dust and bones, shall we then be raised up? And our earliest forefathers too?" Say, the earliest and latest generations will all be gathered on a predetermined day, and you who have gone astray and denied the truth will eat from the bitter tree of Zakum, filling your bellies with it, and drink scalding water, lapping it like thirsty camels. This will be their welcome on the day of judgment. Elsewhere, the peer spouses or divine companions are replaced with the Zabaniya, translated as the guards of hell, who drag the sinners down to hell. The physicality of the torturers in hell, like the physical pleasures of heaven, are thus reliant on the literal resurrection of the body. The rhetorical question of the disbelievers, "Shall we then be raised up?" is evocatively affirmed. When that resurrection occurs is a question of some dispute. Will the damned go immediately to the fire, or will there be a brief reprieve in the grave prior to the Yawm ad-Din? The ultimate fate is unambiguous. Perhaps the most innovative element of the Quranic hell is the contrapasso punishments I mentioned earlier. In Surah 17, those who were blind in this life will be blind in the hereafter. The initial blindness in this life is clearly an unwillingness to see the truth of Muhammad's revelation, a spiritual blindness made literal in the next life. In other passages, the punishments for rejection and refusal are visited upon the body. Those who turned their metaphorical backs on the Quran have their backs or faces burned or roasted. While not as gruesomely descriptive as Dante or other medieval depictions of hell's torments, the presence of contrapasso punishment in the Quran makes sacred this device as part of God's divine judgment. To the extent that it echoes the tortures of the fire as found in contemporary texts like the apocryphal Book of Enoch or the Apocalypse of Paul, the Quranic vision of hell legitimizes popular and prevailing eschatological ideas from the 7th century Near East. The Quran's emphasis on and elaboration of Yawm ad-Din, Judgment Day, the pleasures of the garden and the terror of the fire-fueled apocalyptic imaginings for centuries to come. At least as it's presented in the Quran, Judgment Day and the afterworld are a completely sensible set of consequences. All will be judged for their deeds, with the righteous rewarded and the evil punished. Reward and punishment are corporeal affairs, and lest we risk the latter, it behooves us to embrace the reality of God, God's message via Muhammad, and the truth of God's ultimate justice. While belief in God and the Quran are obviously advantageous to avoiding the fire, God's mercy will prevail for those whose goodness outweighs the bad. As we saw in Surah 99, on that day, people will come forward in separate groups to be shown their deeds. Whoever has done an atom's weight of good will see it, but whoever has done an atom's weight of evil will see that. And then, as Surah 98 concludes, those who believe and do good deeds are the best of people. Their reward with their Lord is everlasting gardens graced with flowing streams, where they will stay forever. God is well pleased with them, and they with him. All this is for those who stand in awe of their Lord.